follows a slightly different format from the previous few sessions we've had, where I think instead of presentations, I think this is going to be very much a conversation between me and Amelie. I think Amelie, we've been talking about it for for the last couple of years. I think we've talked at different level of depths in these different sessions that we've had, and I'm really pleased to kind of have this detailed conversation today with the audience that we have. Um, we've all been talking about the building a skills-based organization, the choosing the right technology, building skill libraries, etc. But quite often we don't really talk about what happens before or after that. So how do you get started with those? And that's what today's conversation is going to be about. So this is the only real slide that I want to talk about, where the importance of skills governance and having the right operations around it, because without the right governance you potentially have the wrong data going in, not the right engagement from your stakeholders. Frameworks can get outdated, inconsistent or duplicate skills can start coming in. But making sure that you start off correctly with the right framework in place and the governance model in place, you'll have, because it's not just a project. Skills is something that is ongoing, and you need to be able to maintain it on an ongoing basis. So how does having the right governance and operational structure help us achieve that success? And with that, I'll stop sharing. And Amelie, do you want to say a few words before we get started into the conversation around yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for having me, Sandeep. Really appreciate you and the team at TalenTeam for creating those series and really enabling those conversations. I think this is a very important topic. We see this all the time, the relevance of skills governance, maintaining your data, making sure it stays relevant over time. So not just in how you establish it the first time, but on an ongoing basis. So very excited about this conversation with you today.
Yeah, great. And I think that's what we want to talk about today. But one of the big things is that governance is quite often overlooked, and I think that's probably the biggest one, Amelie. I think a lot of organizations looking to get started with this, but start to overlook the governance or kind of the long-term sight around this. Why do you think that is, and what risks are there if we don't establish the governance from the start and if it becomes an afterthought?
That's a great question. So, and it is really something critical to think about from the get-go. You don't want to go into a skills project without having thought through what the governance will be like. Do you need to have every single detail nailed out from day one? No, perhaps not. But think about the risk if you don't have any concept around governance. First of all, without governance, your skills frameworks, once you've established them, they can become stale. That means also that they lose credibility. If your data is not up to date anymore, does it even matter anymore, right? So you really want to make sure that in order for employees and managers to keep trusting the data that you have around skills, you have that governance in place that makes sure that this is continuously refreshed. And then you have the other aspect of inconsistency. So, different business units, if you don't have a strong governance practice in place, may start defining different skills. It could be that they are defining them in their own ways. It becomes inconsistent. The granularity level could be very different. You may end up having duplicates or very similar skills. Does it really make sense to track both variants, etc.? So, to really be able to operate at scale throughout your organization, you want to make sure that governance is in place so that you can really rely on solid data. And then the effect of not having good governance in place is that ultimately your compliance and strategic risks are going to increase, right? You're going to find yourself unknowingly having some critical skill gaps you cannot truly see in the data because there's so much overlap or because the data is not reliably set up. So really putting this in place from the beginning will help you avoid some of the most common pitfalls and risks that you could have by not having this established governance in place.
Now, completely agree. And it's such an important point as well. It's not really a technology, but more of an operating model kind of challenge that we have.
Absolutely.
You can design a perfect framework, but without the right process and ownership to actually keep it alive, it will decay. We know that it will decay, and the cost of that kind of getting obsolete can be really high because you've then lost the trust of the business, the users, which can be quite difficult to then maintain. I think as I move on with kind of further conversation as well, I do want to open it up to the audience as well. That given that it's a conversation, as in if there are questions that you have, please do put them in the chat, and we'll incorporate those as Amelie and I talk through these. So would love to take questions as we go along as well. Now, I mean, given kind of what we talked about, right, the need to keep it updated, need to keep it kind of, operational and alive, um, it brings us to the ownership question. Who should own the skills framework? What are you seeing? Is it within HR, talent, learning, or does it actually need a more broader, like a cross-functional approach? What are you seeing with customers?
So the ownership question is a big one, right? And at the end of the day, who should own this? Should it be with HR? Is it the business? Is it IT? Is it a specialized group? What we see is that there are a few different approaches, but if you look at kind of the best practices, typically single ownership is not going to work the best. So very often you may have HR, you may have the learning and development department kind of like anchoring the framework, being the drivers of the conversation, but true ownership from a skills governance perspective ideally requires a more cross-functional model. So you want to include business leaders, you want to include finance and technology and other relevant departments or lines of business to ensure that what you're discussing here really has real-world relevance. And then when we say that the business must co-own the content, it, HR can govern and both the process and the methodology, if you will, but subject matter experts from each function really need to be involved. They're the ones ultimately that really understand the skills in their areas. They understand that, especially if you're looking at advanced technology or very, very specialized kind of lines of business, you really need to make sure you get these data points in and you get like the advice from those experts. So we feel that a federated model tends to be the most effective, where you have kind of a central team that will set the standards, and it can be comprised of stakeholders from the different groups. That team can then set, like I said, the standard. It can set the taxonomy, the governance rules, but you would have perhaps business units being consulted and taking more responsibility when it comes to the skills within their own domain. So really like a cross-pollination of both like a central governance that takes into account the different needs of the different business areas. That's what we see as being a best practice.
Absolutely. Even customers that I'm working with, I think it's almost, I think of the right word, like almost having an anchor point kind of within HR or operations, sorry, HR or kind of the technology operations from that perspective, who provide the structure, the process, but then the content, the relevance, the alignment, the approvals, etc., that starts to come from a broader group, the business and the right stakeholders within. Because this then ensures that along with the technology framework, I think you've also got a business reality that's being reflected within the platforms. So yeah, no, completely agree. I think I'm seeing something quite similar as well. That you need the owners, but then I think the people contributing into it is much wider and cross-functional. Now, I think one model, again, I think it's quite similar to what we were just talking about, is also either having like the idea of a skills center of excellence or skills governance board. And I imagine, I guess, kind of that's what we were kind of talking about just now in terms of what could be set up. But I'm actually seeing those phrases come up as well in terms of setting up a skills center of excellence or a governance board that organizations start to establish.
Yeah. No, we see this, and I think it's a bit of a question of the maturity stage in which you're in, right? In terms of how you establish your skills, how you govern them. I think the more mature an organization here is in this respect, they may already start really formalizing that skill governance within a center of excellence, specifically sitting within HR, for example, or like a group for workforce strategy or workforce planning. There's, some variance here. But that center of excellence is the backbone of skills taxonomy, tooling, governance. Basically, they're the ones kind of like setting up the rules for how this is going to work. And it also really depends on the scale of the organization. So some organizations may start with a dedicated team of 2, 3 people, 4 people. And then, like I said earlier, in a federated model, kind of like discuss with the different business units or subject matter experts of the different areas, while you may have more mature organizations with a much larger set of team, which could comprise also more specific roles, skill architects or technology specialists or other roles that could be part of this. And the idea here is really to have that center of excellence to really bridge not just the different business unit, but also the different processes, such as talent acquisition, learning and development, workforce planning, like these different ways in which skills really like propagate across the processes around the organization.
Yeah, I agree. I think the maturity of the teams, I think, will grow over time as well, kind of as organizations start to adopt it. And at the same time, I don't want to scare a lot of the people listening into this that you need a major, a team setup and an
Agree.
architecture to kind of get this.
Agree.
I think it's about having the vision to have a skills governance or a skills, whether it's a skills governance board or an operation, thinking about it from the start
Mhm.
when you're getting started, there's less, there's of course the project team that's coordinating and guiding you through this, but it should eventually result into something along these lines, whether that happens immediately or a little bit later. But it's important to have this as a vision and kind of what you work towards.
Agree, Sandeep. And like you said, you don't have to have everything set up from the beginning, but at least having this vision, and maybe it's just 2, 3 people to begin with who can like centralize this information, start coordinating, and help get you off the ground with these governance center of excellence.
Yeah. So, I think beyond the initial setup of skills, I mean, there's obviously when we talk about the operations and the governance, there's also the reason why I think we talk about operations governance is because new skills are coming in, skills are being replaced, kind of within roles. So we have the governance in place. What kind of approval review process should exist, or kind of are we seeing when new skills are proposed? How do organizations best handle it?
Yeah. So another really great question, Sandeep, and that's really something that I think is core to the concept of governance, right? So you want to make sure that you're clearly defining the intake, how do skills come in, and
Yeah.
the approval, and then of course, what are you going to do with those skills, right? So those three are key parts of the governance here. So first of all, you want to establish a clear intake process. So making sure that you're clear who is able to propose a new skill, and that can be a very wide range of people or groups or sources, if you will, because at the end of the day you want to look large, but it must go through then a defined workflow or process to make sure that you're clear around what's the business case, why do we need that skill, duplication checks, for example, making sure that you're not trying to duplicate something that's already part of your taxonomy or your library, subject matter validation before any approval. So I know, for example, we have some tools that support standardization that include a duplicate check. It's one of those most basic things. You want to make sure you're not trying to maintain things twice or more in your setup. Then in terms of approval model, you may also think about the different levels of approvals you need. What type of updates are you trying to do? Is it just updating the skill description because you want to revise it slightly? Maybe it's enough to have just a center of excellence or, a combination of center of excellence and the one subject matter expert to review it, and you don't need to go through a full-blown approval process. But if you're adding entire new skill categories or like really significantly expanding your current taxonomy, or retiring some core skills or strategic skills, or like really changing those flags, for example, that could require a sign off for a more senior business stakeholder, for example, to make sure that you're doing things that are aligned with the company strategy. And then making sure that you also find the right balance with the approvals, right? Having a lot of approvals is great, but it can easily turn into a bottleneck. So make sure you set the right cadence that gives you the right level. And that's why I was talking also about like what type of updates are we talking about, right? Do you need a lot of approvals if it's a minor skill update? Or do you want to make sure that you have like the right amount of less friction, but still the right type of scrutiny that needs to happen? So think about how you make it sure that it's not like a free for all, but it's at the same time also not putting those people in as part of your governance team become a bottleneck in the review cycle. So aiming for a lightweight cycle from the beginning, except for major changes, might be a good way to get started.
I completely agree. I think almost looking at more of a tiered approach to ensure that the lighter kind of changes can be implemented, without going through a committee, while the larger structural changes, especially when it impacts roles, etc., that goes through a proper governance tier. So that, and also defining what is light, what kind of goes for approval, so that people don't have to guess. As an example that I'm seeing is where it comes to, for example, skills that are being added to the library to drive learning initiatives. that typically requires less approval depending on the level of changes you're carrying out with that. But introducing new skills because you've got a lot of content to promote towards an upcoming or a horizon skill, I think I'm seeing organizations put some of those in kind of in that lower approval as long as the changes aren't massive. But anything that impacts roles or a decommissioning of a skill, that is typically where I'm also seeing organizations go through that more structured governance.
That's right. It has direct impact on people, right, in those cases or
Yeah.
in those roles. Yeah, absolutely.
And so I think when we talk about these changes, because I think when we talk about the level of changes as well, the longer the gap, the more the changes. But the lesser the gap, it means more frequently you're involving the business, right? In terms of constant involvement with this. So how should organizations decide how often they review the skills framework? Is it continuous? Is it more periodic? Should they be changing it on a daily basis through automated integrations? I think we know the answers to those, but would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, you're certainly going to agree with me on this one, Sandeep. That's a question we get the most, right? This question
Yes.
comes up all the time. How often should we review the skills framework? Look, it kind of depends on the industry, it depends on the maturity model, and depends on a lot of things. But to give you a good sense, a minimum, I would say at least once a year, right? At least once a year, having a structured review is recommended because that allows you to have a comprehensive audit of whether your skills are still relevant. You can, use our tooling and reports, for example, to see which ones are people tracking themselves against. Maybe you see some skills that are not used at all. Do you still need them? Are they relevant? Is there a reason why they're not being used, right? But you may also see emerging gaps or, other needs to kind of shift your business strategy, and you want to make sure you have, you're tracking against a set of skills that map to that. So at least once a year. Now, once a year is kind of like the baseline. There are some functions that we could call like high velocity, very often very technological focused functions, where once a year might not be enough, just due to the nature of how fast things are evolving in those markets and in these business areas. Think about AI technology, right? I mean, there are changes so often right now. If you only look at it once a year, you may be missing out on important trends and important changes. So here in these cases, think about technology, AI, data science, right? Think about there perhaps having a quarterly review cadence for those functions specifically. Certain skills are going to be universal. They're going to stay for a very long time in your organization. You don't need to change those, but those technological ones, maybe once a quarter is a good idea. And then don't forget also what could also trigger otherwise. So outside of the regular cadences that you've set, think about potential triggers for those skill reviews, which could be, for example, you have a major reorg, or you've just merged with another company. There's the new acquisition, new product launch, some other market disruptions that could be relevant to your business, where you're saying, okay, something completely new emerged. We need to make sure this is reflected in our skills framework. So those triggers could also be a moment where you have more of an ad hoc type of review. So that's some guidance that I can give you. Again, it's going to be different by company, but I think having that as a baseline sets you up for a good governance basis.
No, I like that framing as well, and I agree. I think depending on the industry, because it all depends on how prone to changes you are from an industry and the roles perspective, and within the organization as well, looking at the roles. One additional thing that I do also look at, and depending on your process of bringing skills data into the system, is almost looking at where the continuous inputs coming through, but not in success factors, but you've got a measure of kind of the labor market kind of influencing the level of change that the labor market sees in that role, and that triggering some sort of an alert or a need to look into it. But other than that, roles with high changes, departmental changes, acquisition, organization acquisitions, these are quite often the trigger points that I see. But I do always recommend customers that know when the role was last reviewed for skills and ensure
Mhm.
that you don't kind of lapse that 1 year. I think it's important to ensure if you're moving towards a skills-based organization and want to keep your employees engaged from a career development, skills development, and understanding the skills, it's important that these are regularly reviewed. Now,
Absolutely.
when we look at kind of the kind of what triggers these changes and how to manage these changes, obviously we've talked. I just mentioned the labor market data as well. Now, do you, does that have a big role to play in the skills governance? And should organizations be looking at that? Because I know a lot of organizations are building this out, kind of the skills frameworks, etc., internally as well. And how would they kind of, what's the process or what should they look at in terms of updating?
Are you asking me about whether you want to have external data points that will come into the flow as you're looking into updating your skills?
That's right. Yeah. So as in how do you determine kind of the roles have changed or skills have changed for a role, the
Yeah.
processes? Yeah.
Well, there's a combination of factors, right? The first source of data is certainly going to be inside of your organization. You're seeing certain shifts, or sometimes we call it drift, right? Where you've defined a role, but increasingly you see people in that role having different set of skills, or starting to log against different set of skills, or taking trainings against those skills. So that could be an indicator that you must adapt that role, or there's something else, it's some other factor coming into place. That's a good moment for the governance team to come together, review this. And as you said, looking at the role together with the skills and understanding what's happening here. There seems to be a new trend emerging. In terms of labor market data, this is certainly an input that is kind of like the next logical step. Once you have a solid governance process in place that really understands what's happening within the organization, having also a way to have an outside in perspective is certainly important, and bringing external labor market data, whether you're just looking at research and reports, or you're bringing this in a more automated way, allows you to kind of get a better sense of how aligned you are to the overall market. It helps you stay ahead of potential changes. So that's a good thing. It's you're not just reacting to changes, but also being able to kind of see where the trend is going, and understand like, oh, this is a new emerging skill, a new capability. We may want to start tracking it against the people in these particular roles. And so, like I said earlier, like the internal data is telling you what you have today, both what maps to the roles that you've defined, but also like in general, what's the as is status of your organization. Labor market data can be a way to kind of like start being more predictive around it, right? So you kind of see a little bit more about the skills that you will need to have tomorrow. And that can help in order to enable more functions like, for example, workforce planning that you want to really make more, future focused. The other aspect that I find interesting around labor market data is that it can be very helpful to bring objectivity to your ongoing conversation. So within the governance team, no matter if you have a small team of 2 or 3 people, or 10, 20 and more people from different business areas, you will have a lot of different opinions. And having a, I would say, kind of like an objective benchmark from the outside can help you really enable more objective conversations about, do we actually need that skill, right? Is it still really something that's relevant, or have we been having a bit more of a like a internal eye on this, and we've been using that skill for a long time, but maybe it's really not that relevant out there on the market, or in turn something we're missing out on. So in those debates between the business leaders, the governance team, etc., it might be good to really have that additional piece of input in order to see if something is truly emerging as a brand new skill, or if it's just a quick trend. And that neutral, evidence-based data point can be really foundational for good decision making.
Absolutely. I think the combination makes it just so powerful
Yeah.
because, while the labor market provides great insights, but, it aligns to standardized definitions of market roles and things like that. Every organization is slightly different. So, you always need to use a combination of what the labor market tells you, as well as what as an organization you're doing. But I think from kind of, your point in the second half as well, kind of talking about um, if you're too different from the labor market, also questioning and challenging other roles really aligned to what the industry is doing and kind of what we're seeing in, in the competitors and other spaces in the industry as well. So I think that provides kind of a great insight, and combining these two, having the ability to combine these two, I think can be really powerful. And of course, I think this is where I can also plug in some of the, those previous sessions that we've had around being able to build skills library, utilizing labor market data, etc. If you didn't watch the last session, I strongly recommend you do. SAP, of course, have a whole ecosystem around skills, open ecosystem partners. So again, kind of that's something worth looking into to see how that can massively power up your skills framework and analysis that you kind of put together in place.
Okay.
The and again, anyone, if there's comments, you agree, disagree, you're seeing something different, you've got questions, feel free to engage via Q&A or chat, and we'd love to kind of bring those part into our conversations. Um, the one element, I think we've talked a lot around, very specifically around skills, right? However, the other important element, which I think a lot of organizations are not, they're thinking of it as only the starting point, which is job profiles, right?
Yeah.
The job profile is a starting point, but as skills change, especially specifically if we talk about the high turnover skills or rate of change, then job profiles also require similar governance and the ability to update and automatically do this. Is that, are you seeing organizations do a lot of that?
Well, I think it goes hand in hand, right? And that's in a way that's something we touched about a little bit. We touched on a little bit earlier when we spoke about how you want to align your skills to roles, and you start seeing some drift, for example, happening. So keeping those in sync is going to be really important. Skills and job profiles essentially need to evolve together. In an ideal world, you have a skill framework that has really continuously updated job profiles that map to it. If you don't do it, you might not have, the connectivity and the transparency that you need in order to really generate the data you're looking for. So you want to make sure you don't create a disconnect here. You make sure that you have great skill definitions and roles that also describe the work the way it is done today and not 5 years ago, right? And so that goes through having the right skills with the right definitions that map to the right roles. We see anyway a trend increasingly when you think about like job architecture, that this is increasingly being redesigned around skills, right? Where organizations are moving away from those like maybe more classic, more like rigid and strict job descriptions to something that has a job description still, but like there's still a bigger part even made for capturing the skills that belong to a role. And even as you know, in our system, for example, what are the expectations, right? Do I need a senior developer to be level 4 in this, or is it okay if their proficiency level is only 2 for this other skill? So you see a lot more skills coming into play as we connect skills to roles and job profiles. And that also allows you to be also more flexible so that you can really better reflect how work actually gets done today in your organization. The governance, in our view, should really reflect both, right? You need to have the same review cadence, ideally, the same ownership model and an approval process that applies to both skills and roles, because one without the other, skills in themselves are valuable, but they're even more valuable when you can connect them to people's jobs and how they perform in their role, right? So ensuring that they're continuously aligned and that they're in sync will help you really like reinforce the value of both and help you get that continuous clarity, that continuous transparency around what's actually being done and how it's being done in your organization.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, unfortunately, as I'm not seeing as many organizations put as much focus on the maintenance of job profiles on an ongoing basis as I think they should. In fact, I've seen some organizations launch a skills kind of project and to the end users without building out the job profiles kind of completely. And while it can drive some capabilities and it can drive your certain processes and skills, however, when it comes to the overall career talent development, I think it can start to, impact the overall adoption of these capabilities. Also, perhaps, I think getting started with the initial job profiles is one thing, but I think as skills change, as you said, Amelie, I think if the job profile starts to be very disconnected from the skills that are for the role,
Yeah.
then it actually leaves more confusion with the end users around the development. So absolutely, if you're putting governance process for skills, extending it to cover job profile isn't really that much additional effort. Tools, technologies with AI available today, it's a lot easier doable than it was in the past, and the value is absolutely enormous. You're able to maintain alignment between what people can do and what the role requires.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to your point, right, it is it is not simple. We're not saying being out there and saying, oh, it's easy, like half an hour and you're done, right? Obviously, there's a process, there's approvals, there's change management, right? All of these aspects come into play. But with the technology evolving the way it's evolved and how far, like we're both looking, into product people. So we're looking into roadmap and the next capabilities. And we're certainly seeing, like, from a tooling perspective, more capabilities either already available today or available very soon, to help organizations do this at scale and update those job profiles with the skill together in a way that's going to be faster and more consistent.
Absolutely. I see there's a hand up. Mira, I know you've got your hand up, but if you're able to put your question in the chat, that will be great. I think we'll kind of incorporate that into the conversation. Let's talk about AI, right? I think while the focus has been skills, but we know that a lot of this has been, made more easily consumable or more possible because kind of the advancement AI has made in the, in the recent past. How do we see what do you see the AI kind of from a maintenance and evolution of skills framework for these organizations?
Well, when you think about, a use case of having a lot of data that you need to connect and make sense of and bring like different data points together, it seems like a case for AI, right? And so where we see really here a big opportunity for AI to support the evolution and the maintenance of these skills and job profile frameworks. We know that AI is really, really good at scale and speed, right? It can scan thousands of job postings and academic papers, reports, whichever raw data you've got, whether it's an Excel somewhere or some strategy papers out there. So it is able to really take a ton of data at scale and distill it into what are the next emerging skills and what are the outdated ones, etc. And it is much faster than any team of humans could do. So we see this as key to supporting faster and more effective skills governance, and have on our side as well a roadmap of AI capabilities around this, to be frank. And it's not only about speed, right? It's really, AI can also help you drive consistency across the taxonomy, because we can leverage natural language processing and use that to identify, for example, duplicate skills or suggest standardized naming conventions, map skill relationships, and overall just reducing the manual effort of keeping the skills framework clean and coherent. And it's opening new possibilities. So beyond the things that were done manually before that took a lot of time and a lot of effort and were complex to manage, we see that it can also help now with drafting perhaps skill definitions, suggesting proficiency level descriptions, inferencing, and all of the recommendations. So it's not just the maintenance, but it has also potential to really multiply the value of your investment in your skills framework.
Absolutely. And I think almost looking at AI more as an accelerator into being able to do a lot of this. Previously, a lot of this work really held organizations back because of the amount of effort that was required, really speeds it up. But of course, I think what we need to be mindful of is that not utilizing AI as a replacement for governance, keeping that human in the loop, ensuring that what AI provides is you've got the appropriate review process, etc., also becomes, I imagine, equally important.
Yeah, absolutely. Human validation is absolutely critical. It's non-negotiable, in fact, right? AI can surface recommendations. It can crunch the data for you. It can identify patterns. It can, give you all sorts of reasoning to help you make better decisions. But the ultimate judgment in context of what that skill means for your specific business, for your culture, the strategy you have in place, that really requires the human expertise. It requires the human in the loop. We don't want to suggest in any way that you want to over rely on AI here, right? So you want to make sure that you have really still the full control of the data, because even if the AI, for example, suggests things around, labor market, it may not be 100% applicable to your organization. You may have some very unique factors that require a slightly different flavor, a slightly different angle when you look at the skills that AI will not necessarily be able to infer, despite, the greatest capabilities that it's got today. So really embedding that governance team, the subject matter experts, the business leaders to stay and remain active participants in that validation process is going to be key. So that's why we think about it as like a human in the loop governance. So we'll really have the AI tools that help you do things faster with, more of that reasoning and information. So you really have like data driven evidence, but really giving you the full control over how you make those decisions. I think it's where it's important. So AI can do the heavy lifting, the monitoring, the drafting, like flagging of information, etc. But you still want humans to really focus their time on making the right decisions, judgment, prioritization, and then providing the final approval.
Absolutely. I think the human validation also builds trust, right? I think if people in the organization know that every change to the skills framework has been reviewed and approved by people who actually understand the business, are part of the business, there's more trust around that data as well. If it's always just perceived as AI made these changes, I think adoption can start to suffer a little bit as well, because the one, I think the varying trust on AI, hallucination, all of those coming in as well. And while it's getting better, I think the real understanding of role and people stays within the business. So the
Yeah.
human element becomes really important.
And I love that
There's
you brought up, and I love to, sorry, Sandeep, I just love that you brought up trust here, because I think it's an absolute key. Like, why are we talking about governance, right? It's because you want trusted, solid, valid data, right? And that's something that you get also by having these processes in place, by making sure that people understand also that there's always human in the loop there to make the decision, both from like an organization perspective, but even down the chain, as people like validate the data that is about themselves or about their teams, etc. So building trust is hugely important in order to create the data that you need for your business.
That makes sense. There's a question in the chat. Are there taxonomies that companies can view or reference outside of the World Economic Forum's Global Skills Taxonomy? The level 1 to 5 framework is a great example of how to categorize skills and looking for additional inspiration or examples. So, Ernest, there are quite a few available. Kind of when I start with kind of the open source ones, there are of course a few available. Also, I think within the SAP also provides something of a skills plex, which is possibly slightly dated, but I think is a taxonomy that's available. But on top of that, you do have public taxonomies like Singapore Skills Framework, ONET, ESCO. I know that Lightcast possibly have a public version available of their AP or the skill taxonomy available as well. And more recently, I've also seen a new one come up, which is Competent NL, which is Netherlands launching its own skills framework as well, which I haven't been able to access as yet, but apparently it's quite good. So having said that, sorry, Amelie, I'll let you kind of, maybe you're going to say what I'm going to say having said that.
No, it's perfect. I was actually agreeing with you. This is a very good set to start with. Yes.
Yeah, so I think there are quite a lot of these available. However, I think what I would say is when you start to look at multiple frameworks, I think it can start to get very confusing as well. So it is important to review them kind of individually, see if there's one that aligns better to you. And on top of that, there are, as I mentioned earlier, SAP's skills ecosystem partners like TalenTeam and a few others who do look at kind of these various frameworks and are able to personalize skill taxonomies for organizations. So I think on one hand, I do want to talk about what's available, because I think your question was what's available in public. So there are frameworks available in public, but as SAP's partners, there is an additional layer of value that we provide in terms of being able to make sense of this massive volumes of data and frameworks that exist, and being able to align it very specifically to your organization, to your roles for any SAP customers. So, and that's perhaps, I think, just something to be mindful of as well. only one part. So, as in, what would you advise organizations? Mainly, again, kind of coming back to our main topic around skills governance and maintenance. What would be your advice for organizations that are starting out?
Yeah. So look, don't shoot for perfection from the beginning. I think we talked about this earlier. Yes, you may have an extremely mature organization out there that already has a center of excellence and everything is like so set up and processes are fully aligned and you have this great set of subject matter experts. And that's wonderful when you get there. But as you said, Sandeep, it's the vision, right? What matters is setting up this vision and starting really with purpose. Don't wait until you have a flawless framework before launching. You begin with your most critical roles and business units. You make sure you can prove the value quickly. You already have a system in place for reviewing the skills and the roles and the job profiles for this particular group, and that is kind of like your proof of concept, right? It helps you expand from there rather than trying to boil the ocean from the beginning. So that's really something we've been recommending, I think, throughout ever since we launched the Talent Intelligence Hub. And then that governance, as I mentioned, and you heard me say it from the beginning, like invest in it from day one. Really, from day one, bake that into your processes. It's not an afterthought. You can't, just like set up a skills framework, have your library, and be done with it. It needs to really include the idea of, okay, when are we reviewing this, right? What's the next time we take a look at this and validate whether we need to make any changes, whether big or small. The biggest mistake organization makes is really building that beautiful job architecture, beautiful skills framework, but then you don't have a clear ownership process of who will own it, who will govern it, who will maintain it, who will approve any changes to it, and what are the downstream implications. So making sure that you're clear on how this process will get updated, how decisions are getting made, and who governs it is going to be really key, and it should be happening in parallel with your framework design. And then ideally, I would say get executive sponsorship, right? Make sure that you really have a priority put on this and it's clear from the get-go what value this brings to your organization, and that really helps when you can clearly connect it to outcomes that I was saying earlier. As you start with your initial set, whether it's a pilot for a certain group of the employees or for a certain process you want to pilot it with, the sooner you can show the value for it, the easier it is to really make sure that it is deeply ingrained and stays really relevant and prioritized for the business. So whether you're looking to reduce time to hire, or you want to improve internal mobility, you want to build for critical future capabilities because you have ambitious strategic goals that you need people to have the right skills for, whichever it is, if you can tie it to outcomes, this is usually something that will help you also ensure that it's future proof. Yeah. So those would be some advice points that I would like to make sure to communicate.
I love the summary, Amelie. And if there's one thing I could add, that think of skills governance not as an overhead, but something that actually protects your investment. You put in a significant amount of effort into building the framework. Governance kind of is what will ensure that your efforts keep paying off year after year and doesn't just become an initial piece.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Couldn't put it
thank you
better.
so much.
Thank you, Sandeep.
No, absolutely. Sorry, you were going to say something?
No, it's great. Thank you, Sandeep.
I was saying thank you so much. I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. I think the message is clear, right? I think don't ignore skills framework or governance. It's not a one-time initiative. It is something that's ongoing capability, and organizations that treat it that way with proper governance, clear ownership, continuous evolution. They are the ones that are actually that will actually see the return on their investment. So happy to take any questions. Again, any questions to both Amelie or me. Happy to take those. If you've got any, I know, Mira, you've got your hand up. I will see if I'm able to move it to allow to talk. Give me a minute.
I'm just checking the Q&A in the chat, Sandeep, and there's no questions in there currently.
All right. Mira, I've allowed you to talk if you want to come ask your question. You may need to unmute yourself.
Thank you. Neuroscience.
Okay, so I've just got a comment in the question answer saying that was by mistake. Sorry, from Mira.
Yeah.
So her hand was up by mistake. So I'm sure she's not going to join in with the conversation. Thank you very much, Amelie, and thank you, Sandeep.